Tales of Asia is a series of 5 talks, like Jenna mentioned, that takes us to 10 historic port cities in Southeast Asia. Today's talk is the 3rd one, and it will bring us to Bangkok and Phnom Penh. Now, these talks are standalone talks, so you don't need to have sort of attended one of the earlier ones in order to understand what's going on today. But if you do follow the talks to the end, I promise you that you will learn something very profound. I think it's profound, which is that as Singapore, our history is very intricately linked to the rest of these port cities in Southeast Asia. And actually, in many respects, in terms of the urban planning, architecture, and the peoples, we're actually very similar to these other port cities. So, the time frame for the Tales of Asia talks is 500 years, from the 1500s till today, and the setting is the East Indies, what we know today as Southeast Asia. And during these 500 years, most of these 500 years we were traveling in the East Indies, the region was dominated by 7 imperial powers: the British, of course, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, interestingly, the Portuguese and the Germans, and last but not least, Siam, which alone, evaded colonization by the European powers. We will be diving into the 10 most important port and capital cities of these various imperial domains in the course of the talk. The first talk took us to Manila and Malacca, 2 of the oldest cities. Fortress cities, because they were built in the 1500s. The talk before, last week, took us to the canal city of Batavia in the Dutch East Indies. And today's talk will take us to Bangkok and Phnom Penh, cities which again have their histories intricately linked to each other. They're actually very similar, but for some reason they went on different trajectories as they developed. So, if you're ready, I'm going to wind up our time machine and we're going to go way back to the East Indies in the 1500s. Our tale today begins here, in this sort of fabulous vision of a city. Its name was Ayutthaya, and this was the capital of the Siamese kingdom from the 1300s to the 1700s. It was situated at the confluence of 3 rivers, including the famous one, Chao Phraya River, and it was known as the legendary Venice of the East for a couple of reasons. The first being, as you can see, it is a floating city, and it was built on an artificial island carved out from the river. And travelers in the 1500s would recount the story of how they would be sailing up the river for days and days, and suddenly out of nowhere would appear these glittering spires of golden palaces and temples that told them that they had arrived at Ayutthaya. Now, the second reason why it was the Venice of the East was it's pretty obvious here, because it was a canal city. Right? The Siamese, like the Dutch, were experts at river engineering and working with water. And they carved these very intricate lattice of canals through the capital city. And some of these canals can still be seen today. This is sort of like a Google Maps image of Ayutthaya today. And you can see also the outline of the artificial island on which Ayutthaya sat can also still be seen today. Unfortunately, in 1767, the Burmese invaded Siam and they sacked the city of Ayutthaya. And in the course of 2 decades, the Siamese would then sort of pack up their stuff and move their capital down south, down the river, to a place called Bangkok, which was then a kind of village on the river. And there in 1782, a new palace and city was erected by the first founding king of a new Siamese dynasty. This was King Rama I of the Chakri dynasty, which continues to rule Thailand today. King Bhumibol of Thailand is Rama IX, and he's a direct descendant of this first King Rama. So, Bangkok was built to the image of Ayutthaya. This is an image from the early 1800s. Like its predecessor, it was built on an artificial island, carved from the river, the Chao Phraya, through a system of canals. It was a floating city, and an abode, supposedly, of divine celestial beings. And in fact, Bangkok's name was actually not Bangkok at all. The Thais call the city Krong Jeep. And Krong Jeep, in turn, is actually an abbreviation of a much longer formal name. And I'm going to attempt to sort of play it for you so you know how it actually sounds like. Let's hope this works.
กรุงเทพมหานครอมรรัตนโกสินทร์มหินทราวิทยามหานิลมพบนพรัตน์ราชธานีบุรีรมย์อุดมราชนิเวศมหาสถานอมรพิมานอวตารสถิตสกัดทัตติยวิศนุกรรมประสิทธิ์
Yeah, so that's Bangkok's real name. Quite a mouthful. So this is a very stylized map of the city, as I mentioned, from the early 1800s. And at the time, the first 10 accounts of Bangkok, or Krong Jeep rather, actually resembled those accounts of Ayutthaya, in that travelers would recount a city of golden palaces and striking temples with their prongs or towers. And also these are elephants harnessed for a royal promenade. This photograph, for example, is an iconic view of the Grand Palace in Bangkok. It was taken in 1865, and even though it isn't quite a typical view of the city, eventually the European press sort of took it and created a series of prints in the late 1800s that presented this as a sort of typical everyday view of Bangkok city. So here's an example of these. This is in the 1880. And as you can see, the palace has been presented as a sort of window onto everyday life in Bangkok at the time, which served to sort of enhance the city's exoticism for the Europeans eager to explore the mysteries of the East. So, if you were a European traveler visiting Bangkok in 1917, your trusty guidebook, from which this particular map would have been taken, would have recommended a few major sites in the city. The first, of course, is the Grand Palace of the Chakri Kings, which sat on the artificial island of Ratanakosin, this was originally Bangkok itself. And across the river was the precinct of Thonburi, and this is where you would have found some of the most iconic landmarks in Bangkok then and today, such as the Wat Arun, which means the Temple of the Dawn. The other major site in the city would be the main Chao Phraya, which translates into the River of Kings. And flowing through the city, it occupies a place at the very heart of Siamese history and the history of the city. Because for more than 700 years, the kings of Siam have been building their palaces right on the banks of this river, whether it was in Ayutthaya or in Bangkok. And the Chao Phraya has always been the center of trade and travel to the city. And so visitors to the city in the early 1800s would recall it sort of teeming with European ships, with Chinese junks, with sampans, and all manner of sort of sailing vessels. And if they were very, very lucky, on these very special occasions like the king's birthday, they would bear witness to a magnificent royal barge procession, a great show of pomp and majesty that still takes place even today. A procession that had been undertaken for about 700 years since the time of Ayutthaya. So another feature of Bangkok today, which also recalls Ayutthaya, are the canals, the klongs. You can see them all over, these sort of blue bits here. And they were carved sort of deep into the fabric of the city itself. On the Thonburi side of the river, the canals are particularly popular because of these. The floating markets of Bangkok, very famous. And interestingly, speaking of klongs, most people don't realize this, but actually, this entire part of the Chao Phraya River, that main bit, where the royal palace sort of sits, was actually an ancient but massive canal, which was cut in the early 1500s by the kings in Ayutthaya, in order to make, cut short the passage through the Chao Phraya River. So these blue bits here are where the river used to flow. Today they're canals. And if you sort of zoom out, you can see that this used to be a very, very long-winded and troublesome way to get past this bit of the river. So finally, after seeing the sights of Bangkok, as a European tourist, you would have been accommodated here, which was Bang Rak, the trading and consular quarter of the city, It's foreign settlement, and this was established in the mid-1800s by the kings in Bangkok. Let's zoom in a little bit. Bang Rak, which encompasses the Silom district of Bangkok, was and has always been also the center of the city's nightlife and entertainment, because that's where all the foreigners were. This fact still holds true today because it is, as we all know, Silom is Bangkok's financial quarter. It is also the quarter where you find patpong, the sort of entertainment and nightlife, whether seedy or less seedy. What is less well known today, actually, is that in the Silom area, there are still multiple instances of architecture, European-style architecture that remain from the 1800s, particularly along the waterfront. Let's go visit some of these in turn. The most famous of these pieces of European architecture on the waterfront, of course, is the Oriental Hotel, which was Bangkok and Siam's grand hotel, paying host to illustrious celebrities and royalty and heads of state in the day. Today, it's the Mandarin Oriental Bangkok, and the original hotel still stands here. You can't quite see it, it's hidden. Nearby, you see these sort of interesting instances of European architecture. There's a Catholic mission and church straight out of France. And very interestingly, there's this building, which is the eastern headquarters of the East Asiatic Company. So this is an interesting building because this was the Danish East Asiatic Company. It was actually the equivalent of the Dutch and the English East India Company. They never quite gained a toehold in Southeast Asia in terms of colonies. So what they did was they made Bangkok their Far Eastern HQ and brought trade between Bangkok and Copenhagen in Denmark. Further out north, this was the old custom house. It is sort of exists in a state of crumbling glory, Venetian-style crumbling glory. You can see the coat of arms of the Chakri family, the ruling Chakri dynasty here. And today it's a kind of fire station. Around the custom house are all these fabulously evocative facades of former warehouses and trading houses that have fallen into disuse, but they still stand and very interesting, make for a very interesting wander. Nearby are two very important buildings. This is the Portuguese embassy, the Portuguese legation, and it is the oldest embassy in Bangkok because of this reason. Even in the 1500s, the Portuguese had arrived in Ayutthaya to trade, and when the city was sacked by the Burmese, the Portuguese actually followed the Siamese down to Bangkok. The other very important embassy building is this one. Sorry, it's a little out of focus. It's the French legation. And here we stop for an interesting tale. In 1893, French gunboats actually sailed up the Chao Phraya River, intent on forcibly taking Siam as their equivalent of British India. And the boat sailed all the way up to Bangkok, and they docked right here, pointed their cannons to the Royal Palace, poised to take over the city. So this incident, where Siam was actually on the brink of being colonized by France, is known as the Patnam incident, because it was at this place called Patnam, which is a fortified town near the mouth of the Chao Phraya River, that the French first made their approach in their gunboats, and they were refused access. They forcefully went through, sailed up to Bangkok, and then enacted a naval blockade of the city. And this was reported in the British news, big splash in the British newspapers in 1893. So just how did Siam evade this crisis? To answer that question, we have to sort of take a step back 50 years to the time of King Mongkut, who was also known as King Rama IV. So this is King Mongkut. In the mid-1800s, Rama IV realized that Siam was actually in grave danger from the French and the British powers, both of whom were actually encroaching onto Siam. The British from the west, by way of Burma, and the French from the east, by way of Indochina. And so he decided on a rather drastic course of action. He decided that in order to protect himself, Siam needed to modernize or westernize, however you call it, whether it's in terms of institutions, in laws, in the ways of thinking, or in costume. And as part of this effort to westernize, he reached out to and employed from here in Singapore a British lady by the name of Anna Leonowens, and appointed her the royal governess to his many wives and children. Now we know Anna very well, and we also know King Mongkut very well. Very, very well. Here they are, actually, in the Broadway musical, the Hollywood movie, The King and I. Right? Here is how they actually look like. Minus the sort of Hollywood makeup and glamour. So to the left is King Mongkut and his young son, Prince Chulalongkorn at the time, which would take over him. And here is Miss Leonowens. This was towards the end of her life. She was a little younger when she was in Siam. She would go back, of course, to write an autobiography that would be a bestseller in the US. So King Mongkut was succeeded by his son, King Chulalongkorn, or Rama V, and being the first Siamese king to receive a Western education, he was a very, very modern and very, very energetic monarch. And he pushed through many of the reforms that his dad before him actually initiated. He was also a very shrewd diplomat, and these shrewd diplomatic skills were ultimately the reason Siam managed to narrowly evade being colonized by the French, and Bangkok being sort of the capital of French Indochina. In 1897 and again in 1907, Chulalongkorn would make a series of 2 grand tours of Europe. He would sort of whisk through 14 countries on official state visits to his counterparts. And the grand tours evidently were a very calculated charm offensive. This was him. Wherever he went, he presented himself as this sort of immaculately dressed European gentleman in his bespoke sort of fine suits, surrounded by his equally dressed sons. And the Europeans, therefore, were sort of reminded that Siam had come of age. It was now a modern, very civilized nation and was ready to take its place alongside European powers. Unfortunately, charm can only go so far. To guarantee Siam's independence, Chulalongkorn actually had to agree to a series of very painful territorial concessions to both the British and the French in the course of some 50 years. Which returns us back to the Patnam incident in 1893, where the French gunboats are still waiting at the French embassy building with their cannons pointed at the palace. In order to fend off the French, King Chulalongkorn actually sought help from the British, who at the time thought it would be useful to retain Siam as a buffer between French Indochina and British Burma. And between the British and the French, a dirty deal was struck, in order to guarantee Siam's independence. And what Siam had to do was to siege territories to both Britain and France, Laos, all territories to the east of the Mekong River, to France, and the Shan states to British Burma. And this was just the latest in a series of territorial concessions. Earlier on, there had been the ceding of Cochin China to the French in 1862, Tenasserim, to the British Burma in 1868. Cambodia was gradually ceded to the French between 1863 and 1907. And the sort of final stroke came in 1909, when the Malay states, what we know today as Kelantan, Terengganu, Kedah, and Perlis, were ceded to British Malaya, and they still remain as part of the provinces of Malaysia today. So as you can see, Siam probably lost about 40%, if not half of its territories in order to maintain its independence. It's a very high price to pay, but one that worked. And so from then on, the Chakri kings could sit safely on their thrones in the royal palace, secure in the notion that Siam would be free. And the Grand Palace, in turn, became a sort of monument to the wisdom of the kings, and their openness to change and to modern ways of thinking, an openness that would ultimately prove critical to securing their kingdom's freedom. So let's now turn to the Grand Palace. Established in 1782 by King Rama I, it was built like Bangkok was built to recall the fabled city of Ayodhya. In fact, Ayodhya was literally built into the palace because King Rama I had the ruins of Ayodhya tugged down and transported down the river to form the foundations and the walls of the Grand Palace in Bangkok. In style, the Grand Palace was actually very, very eclectic. You can see here. It had been added to successively by each of the kings of the Chakri dynasty, who were variously influenced by Chinese or European architecture, cultural style, resulting in an overall mixed architectural style. There was the Khmer, Siamese, there was the European and also some bits of Chinese architecture thrown in. The centerpiece of the palace is the Wat Phra Kyo, which means the Temple of the Emerald Buddha. And in the temple is enshrined the Emerald Buddha, which was a symbol of the divine right to rule in the Siamese sphere of influence. And it was taken from Vientiane in 1779 when Laos was made a vassal state of Siam. And here is a view beyond the temple walls, where you can see the different styles. There's sort of like a Ceylonese stupa, Khmer, again, Siamese that recalls Ayodhya. And this is a view from the 1930s. This is it today. It looks practically unchanged. And upon entering the Wat Phra Kyo, I think the first thing that you realize, aside from all that gold and glitter, something that we haven't quite touched upon just yet, is that there is a very strange alien quality to the Buddhism in Thailand. Yeah. Thai Buddhism is of the Theravada strand, which originates from Ceylon, and this strand of Buddhism actually incorporates aspects of Hinduism in it. And so alongside the usual array of icons of the Buddha, you will see also these proliferation of celestial beings, monstrous giants like these here, and other creatures from Hindu mythology. Like these Garudas on the sides of the wall of the Wat Phra Kyo itself. Here's a close-up. You can see that the Garudas are actually holding Nagas, which are sort of mystical, many-headed water serpents. There were these, the Singhas, that guarded the entrance to the temple. And then there were these interesting, strange celestial beings, half people and half animal, with names that I can never pronounce, that are actually all over the temple complex. And all these creatures can be found in the great Hindu epic, the Ramayana, which came to Siam sometime in early antiquity, and then it became localized and was adopted as the national epic, and it was known thereafter as the Brahmakian. Which brings me to sort of what to me is sort of the most spectacular site within the Wat Phra Kyo complex, which is this massive, mind-boggling sort of mural that depicts the Ramayana, or the Ramakien, so to speak. And these are painted inside walls, on the insides of the walls that wrap around the Wat Phra Kyo temple. And they present these, images of epic battles that feature Hanuman, the monkey god, tempestuous love affairs like this one between Hanuman and a mermaid, these sort of divine palaces on earth. And you can spend a whole day actually going through the murals in detail. They go on forever and ever and ever. So but I won't do that right here. I'll leave it at that and just note that it is truly a breathtaking sight and worth your closer examination when you're there. Elsewhere in the palace proper, the architecture is also similarly breathtaking, particularly because, as I mentioned, the architecture here is so mixed. And there are places like this one, which was built exactly in the style palaces would have been built in Ayodhya in the 1500s. There are these. There are elements of Chinese influence peppered all over the palace complex, like these lions here that guard the city, and this gentleman here who says, no pictures inside please, and do not eat food inside please, and take off your shoes. There will also be these entirely European palaces, built in a sort of Beaux-Arts style that wouldn't look out of place in Paris. And then there's this. which is the Chakri Mahaprasad. It is the main throne hall of the palace, and it's kind of the crowning glory of the entire complex. And very fittingly, it was commissioned by King Chulalongkorn in 1882. Here it is, in the late 1800s, probably about 10 years old. And it consists of a European-style foundation and a Siamese roof. Again, a sort of mixed of mestizo architecture. And this seems to me to represent Chulalongkorn's own personality. He was a king, both Eastern and Western in outlook. He was shrewd and open to modern technologies and ways of thinking, and yet he was never forgetful of his Siamese roots. So here it is today. It still stands. It's kept in an immaculate state of maintenance, and it's a little surreal as well. So, from their seat in the Grand Palace on the island of Rattanapasin, the Siamese kings ruled over an empire in the Indo-Chinese peninsula. Oh, there he is, Chulalongkorn. And this empire included Cambodia. You recognize this because this is Angkor Wat. And in the wake of the collapse of Angkor and the fall of the Khmer Empire in the 15th century, Cambodia actually fell into a few centuries of darkness and decline. And during which time it was actually fought over by the Siamese and the Vietnamese, who both wanted a piece of it because it allowed for them to control the Mekong Delta. So in 1845, in the aftermath of the Siamese and the Vietnamese War, both sides agreed to a resolution that would mean Cambodia being a vassal state of both Siam and Vietnam. But when the French arrived, of course, given that Cambodia was divided this way, it was pretty easy for the French then to persuade, without much effort, the king of the Cambodians at the time, King Norodom I, to sign his kingdom away as a French protectorate in return for protection from the Siamese. And so a deal was struck between the French and the Siamese that allowed for the Vietnamese portion of Cambodia to become a French protectorate, while Siam actually retained and annexed the western half of Cambodia, which was in its sphere of influence. So again, what this means is that, in effect, the most symbolically important of all the ancestral lands of Cambodia, Angkor and its surrounds, actually remained in Siamese hands rather than Cambodian hands. And there is to this day in the Grand Palace in Bangkok a miniature model of Angkor to push home the fact, to remind everyone of the fact that Siam was once a ruler over Angkor in Cambodia. In the meantime, the French had the Cambodian royalty moved to the very sleepy town and port settlement of Phnom Penh, where they proceeded to build a brand new royal capital with all the trappings of empire, including this, which is a royal Naga bridge across which the royal elephants could proceed on procession. They also built a riverfront royal palace, using the Grand Palace in Bangkok as a model. And this sat on the banks of the Tonle Sap River, near to the confluence of the Tonle Sap and the Mekong River. And life sort of proceeded, it just went to trundle along for the French protectorate of Cambodia until 1904, when King Norodom I passed away. And instead of handing over the crown to the son of King Norodom, who was rebelliously Franco-phobic, the crown instead passed on to the king's 64-year-old brother, King Sisawath. So here are the French, sort of listening to La Marseillaise at the inauguration of King Sisawath's statue. And here is King Sisawath himself. Despite his age, he wasn't one to be underestimated. In 1906, just 2 years after he was crowned, he made the unprecedented move of being the first Cambodian sitting king to ever leave the country. And where he went to was France that autumn, in order to pay a visit to the colonial exposition in Marseille. and to do a bit of a charm offensive as well, like his counterpart and probably his nemesis, King Chulalongkorn, had done. So this is him in Paris, and his arrival in Paris caused quite a stir. The newspapers and tabloids alike have splashed images of him all over the front pages. That's him right there. And the Parisians, who were initially very skeptical of this very exotic person, were entirely won over by him, Sa Majesté, le roi du Cambodge, who sort of exaggerated his own fairy tale-like persona by always appearing in this, royal, regal Cambodian regalia. He was a very shrewd statesman as well, because he referred to the French as his adoptive mother, and then he also referenced the territories held by Siam as equivalent to Alsace-Lorraine, which at the time was actually held by the Germans. In a stroke of genius, the king brought with him the Cambodian Royal Ballet, a magical fairy tale-like ensemble of elfin dancers, mostly girls, not much older than children. And the Cambodian Royal Ballet performed at the Colonial Exposition in Marseille. They also performed thereafter in Paris, in the Bois de Boulogne, as well as at the residence of the President of the Republic. They were a revelation to the adoring crowds in France. In particular, one Monsieur Auguste Rodin, who was so captivated by their sense of poise and rhythm and movement that he actually created a series of 140 watercolors of the dancers. So, all in all, His Majesty's trip to Paris was a huge success, so much so that when he returned to Cambodia, he sent a very impassioned letter to the resident superior of the French Republic in Cambodia, protesting against the continued occupation of Cambodian lands by Siam. This is the letter. I don't think you can read it, so I'm going to just try to give you the gist. We insist on the ancient natural limits of the Khmer Kingdom, which before the Siamese invasion included the Siamese side of the border, presently the provinces of Battambang, Siem Reap, etc., etc. And all these provinces are still populated by Cambodians and preserve a patriotism absolutely Khmer. The richest provinces of Cambodia are precisely those of Battambang and Siem Reap. In the latter province, the ruins of our kingdom's old and powerful capital still stand. They are brilliant proof of the grandeur of our ancestors. These two provinces, just like the others, were never given to Siam by any of my predecessors. And our claims, in view of their return to Cambodia, have never ceased, and will never cease, as long as satisfaction is not given to us in this regard. It goes on for quite a long time. But it seems to have done the job, because in 1907, the French forced Siam to cede Angkor and the other territories mentioned to the French protectorate of Cambodia in return for Siam's continued independence. And this incident in particular proves actually to be rather interesting, because it is an instance where a nation had managed to regain its territorial integrity, while the sovereignty of these territories actually lay in someone else's hands. But what's done was done, and so the French and Sa Majesté le Roi du Cambodge returned to Phnom Penh, to the royal palace on the banks of the Tonle Sap to celebrate this occasion. And so now we turned our gaze to the Cambodian royal palace in Phnom Penh. This is it. It was built in 1866. Well, its work started in 1866, so it's about 100 years younger than its sort of sister palace, the Grand Palace in Bangkok. In terms of the architecture and layout of the palace, it's actually very similar to the Grand Palace, because Latin was actually used as a model. Yeah, right down to the royal elephants, the elephant stables. This is a sort of classic postcard view of Phnom Penh. The elephants sort of settled up for a walk in the city. Today, of course, there are no longer any elephants in Phnom Penh. So I mentioned that the Grand Palace in Bangkok and the Royal Palace in Phnom Penh were actually very similar, except for one key difference. While the Grand Palace in Bangkok was built by the Siamese, the Cambodian Royal Palace was actually commissioned and built by the French. And while the Grand Palace actually featured a very eclectic diversity of architectural styles that reflected the openness and the tolerance of the Siamese kings, the Cambodian royal palace was very self-consciously designed in the quote-unquote traditional Khmer style that in reality the French had actually very helpfully quote-unquote revived or concocted on behalf of the Cambodians. And like the Grand Palace in Bangkok, the most important structure in the palace is the Wat Phra Kyo, the Temple of the Emerald Buddha. And there was also an Emerald Buddha in here, though it was not the same one as the one in Bangkok, and its origins are still disputed. It's said to be built to be made out of either glass or crystal. The temple was also known as the Silver Pagoda, because if you enter, you'll see that the floor is literally paved in silver. Here is the Wat Phra Kyo today. And note also that the Cambodians, or the French most probably, had another miniature model of Angkor built right here, as is to say to the Siamese, this is ours, please back off. The similarities to the Wat Phra Kyo in Siam don't end here. In the royal palace's Wat Phra Kyo also, there is an epic mural of the Ramayana that's known as the Riamka in Cambodia that wraps around the inside walls, the insides of the walls of the temple. And in my opinion, actually, these murals are far superior to the Siamese ones. I hope there's no one here from Thailand. For two reasons. The first being, I just feel that there's far more sort of fire and personality in the characters that are depicted, as compared to the ones in Bangkok, which are a bit more classical and a bit more stylized. And the second reason why these are far more superior in my mind is because they are literally riddled with bullet holes from the Khmer Rouge era, and some of the paint has fallen off. So it all kind of makes for a rather tragic and evocative ensemble. Although these were taken during the time when the murals were being restored, so I think they might have already been restored. Some other views of the mural. You can see they were severely damaged during the Khmer Rouge era. The paint is quite literally falling off. But they present the same sort of scenes of epic battles from the Ramayana, and these heavenly palaces, even sailing ships. These are Chinese or possibly Cambodian ships on the river. Elsewhere in the palace, another very interesting instance of architecture is the Napoleon III Pavilion. Some of you might have seen this. And this pavilion, it's quite interesting because it was originally built for the Empress Eugenie, the wife of the Emperor Napoleon III, to inaugurate the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. And if you see, not very clear, but on the glass here, it says N, which stands for Napoleon, of course. So when the Suez Canal was opened, there was a question of what to do with this pavilion. And so Napoleon III had this brilliant idea, this brilliant thought, N stands for Napoleon, but it could also stand for Norodom. So he sort of packed up this pavilion and gave it to King Norodom I in Cambodia. It was dispatched from the Suez to the Royal Palace, and it stands here today. Let's step out into the city. Outside of the palace, which sat here to the south of Phnom Penh, the French built a colonial quarter to the north, and a Chinese quarter somewhere in the middle, where for centuries there had been Chinese merchants actually trading and living here in the city. And Phnom Penh, thankfully, was spared most of the destruction from World War II. And in the aftermath of its independence in 1954 from the French, it actually enjoyed somewhat of a revival culturally when it came under the reign of King Norodom Sihanouk. Some of you might be familiar with His Majesty. And as such, much of the historic architecture in the building actually still, in the city actually still remains, like this. The General Post Office, which was built in the 1890s, very sort of wedding cake-like. The Foreign Correspondence Club, and the National Museum of Cambodia, which was again designed by a French architect in a sort of Khmer revival style. Here's another landmark, the Saat-Mei, or the Central Market, again designed by a French architect, built in the 1930s in an Art Deco style. There are these many sort of French colonial villas that dot the city, particularly down this main street, Noordam Boulevard, and they still stand today, though many of them are in danger of being demolished due to demolition. And finally, my favorite bits of the city are the bits between Street 118 to 172. Those of you who know would know that the city streets in Cambodia are actually numbered. There are no names. And this used to be the former sort of Chinese merchants' quarter. And this is lovely because you can walk here for hours and hours and hours and explore the sort of 1930s to 1950s style apartment architecture that makes it all feel a bit like Singapore or Hong Kong in the 1960s. But of course, the 50s and the 60s, the idyll of the 50s and the 60s did not last forever. We know what happened in the late 70s and 80s. The Khmer Rouge, and Phnom Penh was actually hit quite hard. For 3 years, the city was actually emptied out, so everybody was chased out of the city and it became a sort of a ghost town. And many of the inhabitants, particularly if you're an academic or an intellectual, teachers, the Cambodian ballet, even monks, were herded off to be executed en masse in the killing fields. And you can still visit the killing fields today. And so, and one of the last things I wanted to play today was a video of the city during this era when it was a ghost town. There's nothing graphic here at all. It just shows the city when it lay empty, and I hope it provides a sort of evocative view of how it was like then. The Central Market. This was the former Chinese quarter. So I really don't want to end this on a very low note, so I thought I'd show a couple of images of Phnom Penh today. The city has really picked up from where it was before, and I think when you visit Phnom Penh, you realize that the Phnom Penhers are really determined to get on with their lives. So everywhere in the city, I think you see these signs of of revival and of life, and it's very much a booming city right now. I went to the city a couple of years back when they had this sort of tourist campaign going here called Phnom Penh, Charmante Ville, or the Charming City. And in fact, I do have to say that it was particularly charming because you walk through the streets and you find in the streets of the Chinese Quarter, for example, everybody's sort of going on about their lives as if nothing has ever happened, and there's so much color, there's so much wonderful food that is starting to spring up again in these streets. Particularly, I think you get this sense of energy on the banks of the Tonle Sap River today, where in the early evenings, these families, the Phnom Penhers come out en masse, and they sort of enjoy themselves at riverbanks. There are all these small seafood or zicha restaurants actually on the banks of the river, and you hear the music playing and everyone's just having a good time with their families, admiring the wonderful sunset. And it is here, I guess, on a sort of a boat cruise down the Tonle Sap, admiring the sunset, that I end off our journey today to Cambodia and to Bangkok. I hope you have sort of gotten a sense of the history and the sort of overview of the cities then and today. More details of the cities can actually be found in my book, The Romance of the Grand Tour, 100 Years of Travel in Southeast Asia. I video each of these talks, and the videos also may be found on the blog, romanceofthegrandtour.com, or on my Facebook page. So the videos of the last two talks can be found there, and I'll be putting tonight's and the next two talks videos also online. So next week, we visit French Indochina at the Marine Parade Public Library on Sunday, 8th of November. And we go there to sort of revel in La Belle Époque in the city of Saigon, which is today's Ho Chi Minh City. And we also examine how sort of the French brought their civilisation française to Hanoi and they came up against something that was far older, which was the Chinese influence, which had been there for hundreds of years. If you are interested, please do join me also for the Singapore Rajas Festival. I will be on a panel next Saturday with this lady, Miss Elizabeth Pisani, who is a journalist, and we'll be discussing this very interesting topic of Southeast Asian identity. How do we, articulate, or how do we make sense of Southeast Asia with its colonial history, with its many mixed peoples and cultures that have arrived due to trade and travel within the region and between this region and other places. So here again are the series of talks. Do please join me next Saturday and Sunday, and I thank you very much for your patience, and I wish you a good evening.